RuneScape just dropped the mother of all blogs. This might be the longest blog ever posted. So long, in fact, that it actually had to be split into 2 distinct pages. This is a response to the previous and slightly vague announcement that there would be some drop table nerfs to common drops and some possible buffs as well. And now we've got answers on exactly what's changing, and more importantly than that, why. Quick warning here, I will put some timestamps, so if you're just interested in what's changing or what things are being buffed, what things are being nerfed, you can jump to that part as well. But in the last video I made where I was very critical of the proposed changes, I asked for more detail and more rationale because I wanted to be able to see it and pick it apart and also decide for myself if I thought it made sense and be able to see some of the numbers behind the decision making. And well, they've actually delivered. So not only is there a very, very lengthy list of changes that have been made to a number of different bosses and pieces of content, including things like Zamorak, Glacor, Kerapac, Wilderness Splash events, and more, but there's also a ton of good data in here and a ton of rationale. And I think it would be a little hypocritical of me to skip over all of the rationale, even if some people find it a little less interesting, and just go over the changes. So with that said, let's read the entirety of this news post, and I will also give you my thoughts on every section. So with that said, buckle up, this is going to be a very long one, and let's get into it. Hey everyone, we've spent some time in our balancing dungeon and we're back today to give you an update on the recent economy changes that we discussed last month as part of a game health update. For a little context, in April, we released a news post titled Roadmap Check-in May as a quickfire look at everything happening this month. This included a summary of a game health update to tune the drop tables of a handful of more recent bosses and Wildy Flash events due to the effect they had on the game's economy. We made the mistake of not covering this in a lot of detail, which understandably caused a lot of confusion, leaving you without much context or explanation. There were also some clear concerns in the community about certain content we were touching too. We delayed the initial release to refine our approach based on your feedback and provide a more detailed look at our intentions, which is in this blog. We'll start by explaining what exactly a game health update is and what type of things they cover and why they matter. In the second part of this blog, we'll break down the drop table changes discussed last month, including the adjustments we've made since delaying them, and provide our reasoning for making all the changes we have. So to start things off, I'm glad that there is an admission that the previous blog was not terribly good. It caused an absolute mass panic, and I'm really glad to see a very more detailed blog that hopefully has some good explanations and some good rationale. To start things off, what are game health updates? Broadly speaking, the term game health update is an umbrella for any form of changes that we make to the game which we deem necessary to maintain and improve how the game is doing. This can refer to game progression, encapsulating things like skilling, quests, unlocks, game difficulty, and game modes such as Iron Man. The game's economy with rebalances, which can encompass buffs, nerfs, or neutral changes. Game systems and how you interact with the game, such as the tutorial system, clan system, grouping system, or the user interface. Quality of life updates in their various forms, and technical updates such as code performance and maintenance. In short, they can target a wide variety of things to ensure the game continues to provide a strong RuneScape experience while mitigating dangers that could affect the journey and experience of all players, from new to veteran. Many of our past updates would also count as game health updates, even if not directly called one. After almost 25 years of being online and receiving weekly updates, RuneScape is a huge game with a complex web of interconnected content and systems that we need to maintain the balance of. RS is truly a living and breathing entity, one that needs to be maintained for another 25 years and more still ahead of us. If you're familiar with old school RuneScape's Project Rebalance or Summer Sweep Up, then these are very similar. We understand that such changes won't always be loved. Changing aspects of content that players have frequently engaged with is going to cause some friction, especially if they're lucrative or very rewarding. However, maintaining the game's health and providing a solid game experience requires making such changes. Keeping the community at its core is what RuneScape does best. It's for this very reason that we delayed the update to make sure we captured and addressed the concerns you raised. And we want to hear your thoughts on what other drop tables or areas of the game could also use updates like this. As one would probably expect, the opening paragraph is pretty vague. It's basically saying a game health update could be anything that improves the health of the game, which more or less makes sense. But I also do like the mentions of putting the community first and making changes based on the feedback from the previous blog, and I'm excited to see what that actually entails. So let's continue. Why are game health updates necessary? The playing field is always changing. RuneScape players know that game updates can have varying effects on the meta of skilling and PVMing or on the value of existing in-game items, be it monetary or sentimental. Through its lifetime, RuneScape has seen many such scenarios where a game update can decrease or increase the GP value of an item, making a training method more or less viable, or even change the difficulty and grind of content. In most cases, this is just a fact of life for RuneScape. In some cases, we need to step in to maintain things we anticipate or know you would like maintained. As much as we don't want to change the content you love, this interconnectedness and the sheer size of the game means it's important for us to tend to the areas of the game that need attention. Maintaining the game's health is a continuous effort, and it won't be something that could ever be completed. Truthfully, we may never get around to doing everything with how big the game is, but we believe that taking it step by step and trying is better than doing nothing at all. It's also important to note that there is no time frame by which content is subject to change or not. Problematic content or systems are problematic regardless of how long they've been in the game or how long the problems have existed. With that being said, we always want to give you a heads up and gather feedback where we can. I think this paragraph's pretty important because a lot of players were very critical of the timing. A lot of people, myself included, were saying early bird bonus, and it is crazy to do this after so many years. And while I totally agree with the idea that it is absolutely better to make changes now than not make them at all, and that's sort of what this paragraph is saying, I still do wish that these updates were done more frequently and more quickly as to not give players this early bird bonus feeling or feel like you're taking something away from your players after many years. With that said though, I do absolutely agree that the best time to make a change would be immediately as soon as there's a problem, and the second best time to make that change would be now, as soon as you possibly can. There definitely shouldn't be a window of time where if there's a problem that persists for longer than that amount of time, it can't be changed, as the end result of that is probably just a worse game. With that said, let's keep reading on. In regard to the recent drop table changes we presented, all of these drop tables were selected as they are major contributors to gold entering the game, either directly or through alchable items. They're also major contributors to oversupplying certain items from their common loot table, injecting into the economy an overabundance of them, which negatively impacts the value of those items. In some cases, like Glacor, the bosses also harmed game progression by allowing players to easily gain GP, skilling ingredients, and combat XP all at the same time while AFKing. It's for these kinds of reasons that game health updates are necessary. As game designers, we know how fun it can be to feel like you're progressing at an accelerated pace or find the thing to farm for a specific item you need. We routinely consider this when we design content. However, when it reaches a stage that is actively harming the game's economy and a player's experience playing through RuneScape, we need to act upon it. It would never be possible to create an exact method or pace we want players to experience RuneScape through, nor do we want that. However, rebalancing is and will continue to be an ongoing, evolving process. Although they may affect a certain boss or a method that a group of players really like, game health updates are a positive change for the game and the player base as a whole. Maintaining a steady influx of certain items helps preserve their long-term value, even if the effects aren't immediately noticeable. Regulating the supply of alchables or raw gold in particular helps curb inflation and can also support balanced game progression by managing the pace at which players advance. While we're not aiming to prescribe a single way to play RuneScape, it's important to ensure the game continues delivering on the rich and rewarding experience it's known for the past 25 years. I think it's really interesting that progression and the player journey is being mentioned here so much and so overtly. The thing that's interesting to me about that is this is kind of a reaping and a sowing situation, because to me, Elder God Wars was always overpowered, but if you go back to when Elder God Wars came out, it was also designed to completely circumvent a number of the grinds that players were meant to go through in the early game. Instead of having to worry about how to get GP, you'd get it from Glacor. You want to get charms? You'd also get them from Glacor. You want combat XP? Well, guess what? That is also zero mechanic Arch Glacor. And at the time, it kind of felt like that was by design. It seemed like there was a very high priority to pump up the engagement numbers as much as humanly possible, which is also why God Wars Dungeons 1 and 2 have more requirements to enter than God Wars Dungeon 3. Kind of doesn't really make sense in a vacuum, but it kind of felt like it was designed specifically to do that. So I'm very curious to see this brought up as a problem now, because it seems like the design philosophy may have shifted to a more balanced gameplay loop for the player, where you're going to different places to get different things, as opposed to just going to Elder God Wars as soon as you possibly can to get everything you need. In terms of how I feel about this personally, I think it's actually a good thing. There is so much to RuneScape, and having a couple pointed areas that are so overpowered at so many different level brackets probably isn't ideal. But at the same time, I do want to mention that it does feel like Arch Glacor was set up to be like this on purpose. So this is definitely a walking back and a changing of an issue that was more or less, in my opinion, intentionally introduced at the time to bring as many players to the content as humanly possible. Definitely let me know what you think about this one. Player journey and player progression is such an interesting and contentious topic, and it's always interesting hearing what other RuneScape players experience and how they view the progression of the game, especially for the early and the mid game. With that said, we've got a lot of blog left, so let's keep on reading on. Update on proposed economy changes. To reiterate from our original news post, these changes were targeted mostly at Elder Godor's bosses, alongside Raksha and Wilderness Flash events. These areas are a clear outlier with their influx of GP and oversupply of items coming into the game. For most, this was mainly from their common loot pools, while in some other cases it was necessary to make wider changes. No rare or unique items were nerfed, and instead, some were buffed. As we got together to review the changes, we determined it best to make more holistic tweaks after reviewing the data once more, including reintroducing some value to some of the weaker drops that were changed. In addition to the original changes, we broadened the list of bosses and reviewed Croesus, Vorkath, Hermod, and Rasial, and made changes to both Vorkath and Rasial. Croesus and Hermod remain unchanged. Before we get into the specifics, it's good to lay out our design philosophy for these changes and future ones. GP, Alchables, and inflation. Alchables bring a lot of raw GP into the game, sometimes more than we're comfortable with. A big reason for this is many of the bosses covered within this update. Such amounts of gold injection into the game contributes heavily toward inflation, and while inflation itself is not a bad thing, uncontrolled inflation certainly is. An overabundance of GP in the game means that item prices also fluctuate, requiring more GP to buy things overall, and result in an inconsistent player understanding of item values. In other scenarios, high amounts of accessible GP can also hurt game progression, like in the case of Iron Man mode, where the objective is to play Runescape with limitations that impose a harder game difficulty. Many of you have seen game data from our January 2023 news post called Death Costs, A Matter of Life and Death, which showed the top 10 gold sources and how much they added to the game each day on average. We've provided the same data again and included up-to-date data from this month for comparison to demonstrate the situation we're in right now. So for starters, I really like that this is being done. I think it's really good to both show the frame of reference that all of the players were talking about and all the creators were talking about in their videos, and then also update that data, give us a new, fresh look at exactly where we're at today. If you compare the data from May 2025 to the data from January 2023, we're going to see here that there's an extra 20 billion GP added every single day via alchemy invention machines, and a ton of additional money via high alchemy as well, where high alchemy used to be generating 24.5 billion GP per day, and now it is all the way up to generating 57 billion gold per day. I have no idea who is doing all of this manual high alchemy, but it is apparently a lot of players. One other really interesting thing to look at here is the amount of GP being brought into the game via Treasure Hunter. In January of 2023, this value, if you add up the Treasure Hunter cash bags and the Treasure Hunter direct coin prizes, is 9.5 billion GP per day. And if you go to May of 2025, you're going to see that while most of the other sources of gold in the game have gone up, Treasure Hunter has actually gone down just a little bit. You'll see that the value of GP coming into the game from Treasure Hunter has gone down from 9.5 billion coins per day to about 9. It's not a massive decrease, but I'm glad at least that that is one of the few things that has gone down and not up. As you can see, high alchemy is the breadwinner, either directly or through things like invention machines and the spring cleaner. Compared to January 2023, invention machines are now bringing in an extra 20 billion GP each day. Meanwhile, GP introduced from direct high alching has more than doubled. It's clear from this data that we have to take action due to the effects these are having. Now that we've had an updated look at how much GP is entering the game and from which sources, the next section is titled Item Influx and Oversupply. Similarly, the overabundance of items also negatively impacts their prices. To put it simply, the more of an item that comes into the game and stays in the game, the less value it has over time as it becomes cheaper. A decreasing value of an item over time leads to drop tables dwindling in terms of how strong they may be across the board. What this means is a boss that was once decent for its commons is now depending more heavily on the bigger drops. Skilling profitability can simultaneously suffer, as items that may have once been sought after for skilling are now oversupplied from other places. Once again, this can also affect game progression by allowing too easy access to things like skilling supplies or gear. Additionally, a decrease in value also means it's harder to place that item on other drop tables, especially in new content. By addressing these situations, it allows us to maintain the rate at which items come into the game. Reducing the oversupply over time allows the item to once again gain some value. Although the effects of this are usually not immediate, we know from past changes such as the Croesus drop table adjustments back in 2023 that prices do recover given some time. As an example, cockatrice eggs dropped from 6,500 GP to as low as 100 GP with the Croesus release. Though ever since the February 2023 drop table adjustments, they've continued to trend back upwards, currently at about 1.1k GP. The image below shows the past 5 years of price data for the cockatrice eggs and the key points at which it changed. As you can see here, cockatrice eggs had a ton of value, Croesus came out, they tanked to 100 GP, and now, after a couple years, they're sitting at about 1,200 coins. So this is data to support that if the oversupply of a skilling item is reduced, the price will actually gradually recover. While the data does look good, and this does explain what the expected and intended behavior is of these adjustments, one other thing that is not being mentioned here that I do want to call out just a little bit is everything on the demand side. There's a discussion here of how skilling profitability can suffer, as items that may have once been sought after for skilling are now oversupplied from other places. But you could also take the exact same first half of the sentence and say skilling profitability can also suffer, as items that may once have been sought after from skilling are no longer used for skilling because of things like treasure hunter XP and proteins. While the data here does make sense, I would like to see a mention of things like microtransactions and the impact they also have on skilling, because it is without a doubt significant too. That isn't to say that they shouldn't also make economy changes if they deem them to be necessary and nerf some common drops, but when you're talking about skilling items that are oversupplied and ways to make the prices go up, one way to make the price go up is to reduce supply, which is being shown right here. But another way to amplify this effect would be to at the same time also increase demand. I made a full video a couple weeks back about exactly how you would do this, and I've linked it in the description down below, and not to repeat everything I said in that video, but basically things like treasure hunter XP, direct XP, proteins, and daily challenges all make it so that a player can train their skills without using any skilling supplies. So if you made a reduction to any of those things, you would also increase the value of those skilling supplies. At the same time, you could also create sinks for a lot of these skilling supplies. So imagine in this exact example, if while you also reduced the drop rate of the cockatrice eggs, you also introduced a new potion that used cockatrice eggs, all of a sudden, you'd likely see an even higher price today than it currently is. It's definitely a fine line and it's not easy to do, but I find when we're talking about the economy and the health of the game, not seeing a whole lot of info about this major aspect that has a huge impact on it, I don't know, it rubs me the wrong way just a little bit. While I am very sympathetic to the idea that a lot of the people who are working on curating the game and improving the health of the game have their hands tied with regard to microtransactions, I still would have liked to have seen it mentioned here. I doubt that we're ever going to be able to get the answers that we actually want and the data that we actually want, but it does feel a little bit like ignoring the elephant of the room. This chart is outlining exactly what the intended result of these changes are. They're effectively saying there are a number of items in the game right now that are the cockatrice eggs that are at 100 GP, and they're planning on choking the supply in a similar way to make the price a little bit more valuable. And in that sense, it is likely to work. But let's get into the actual specifics of what's being changed. While we'll give further context on the changes below, we'll drop a little statistic right now to highlight the severity of the situation. Currently, all of the Banite Stone Spirits entering the game from NPCs on a daily basis, Glacor alone is responsible for 95% of them, with Hermod as the next largest contributor with just 3%. This effect is also visible when looking at the value of these stone spirits. There's a direct correlation between the sharp decrease of their value and the release of the Glacor. Unfortunately, the story is similar for many of the items found in the drop tables of the Glacor and other Elder God bosses, which you can see for yourself by looking at the price charts of those items via the RS Wiki. This kind of data is really good to see and very good to be shared. Something I was very critical of in the previous blog is if you blanket nerf the common drops from a number of different bosses and it's items that come into the game from a number of different sources, instead of allowing the price to recover, all you're really doing is nerfing those bosses. But if these nerfs in these drop table changes are very specific to offenders like the Banite Stone Spirits from the Glacor, which are responsible for 95% of the market, the expectation is that this will actually have a positive impact on the price. So in that sense, this would actually be a very good and a very positive change that should allow the market to correct itself over time. Now we're into the final section of the first part of this blog, titled Game Progression and the Player Journey. The final pillar of our design philosophy regarding these changes is maintaining game progression. Some of the changes we're making, especially with Alchables and others, which we'll detail below, aim at preserving some of the grind that RuneScape is known for. However, it also serves to ensure that content is relevant throughout the game. While we know that the grind is very different 20 plus years on, we still want to maintain an enjoyable and traditional RuneScape experience without letting players accelerate too fast with disproportionate input. Players can unintentionally change their experience of the game by skipping over large sections of iconic content because certain newer content has completely surpassed it. This is especially true for bosses like Glacor, which provide decent combat XP, skilling supplies for a variety of skills, and raw GP through coins and alchables, all with a low barrier of entry for AFKing. For example, it wouldn't make much sense for a player to go and do certain bosses when they could just camp Glacor, use the gold from that to buy other gear, and skip parts of the progression almost unintentionally. For a boss whose mechanics are meant to teach new players RuneScape's combat system, we know you'll agree this isn't how RuneScape should be played. With Group Iron Man, we've also observed that Glacor has been the go-to method for all the above, meaning players ignore content that could otherwise be both beneficial and enjoyable. As you can see from the above, it's a complex situation. Everything is connected, and there's no right answer, highlighting the necessity to tweak and maintain things continuously where possible. Ultimately, all of us, JMods and players, care deeply about PVM and all other aspects of RuneScape and want to make sure it remains healthy and balanced. So this is very close to what I said earlier on when I was reading through this, which is that game progression and player journey are important. And I think this is very, very clearly a step back and a change in direction from previous. I don't know if this is an ownership thing or a leadership thing, but it felt like when Elder God Wars came out, it was designed to be the one-stop shop for absolutely everything. And it was designed to actually run over and completely nullify a lot of the content in the game, because why would you bother doing the old stuff when you could do the new stuff that is also the most rewarding? Personally, I'm actually really happy to see this dialed back, because as someone that has made a ton of new accounts over different periods of time, I made a brand new Hardcore Iron Man about 6 or 7 years ago, and then I made another Hardcore Iron Man 3 years ago. And then most recently with Group Iron Man mode, I will say the early game experience that I had in this new Group Iron Man situation was the worst that I've had. It was very much just a speed run to get to Glacor and the Elder God Wars, and then a lot of your skills and a lot of the progression points that you previously needed to think about and worry about and play a variety of different pieces of content to get through was just all sorted all at the same time, all via AFKing. So to me personally, as someone that has made a lot of new accounts, specifically for Iron Man, I'm actually kind of glad to see this being dialed back. As much as Elder God Wars was very overpowered, it also made the game feel very small, because it was pretty much the only thing worth doing for about half of your objectives. But with that said, let's get into the specific changes. I'm going to read through every single one of them, and then boss by boss, I will give you my thoughts. We've got a ton of nerfs, but we've also got some absolutely massive buffs too, so this should be a super interesting one to get into. With that said, let's begin. Breakdown of changes. Although last month's news post was only a summary intended to be followed up with another post providing further details, we understood your concerns and need to be clearer with what changes we're making ahead of time. The following breakdowns will highlight the changes we've made to the content and drop tables, as well as an explanation for those changes. All these changes were made with the design philosophy outlined in part 1 serving as our guidelines. Following the delay to the update, we sat down once again and made some additional data-facilitated tweaks and changes, although quantities were lowered across the board. In various places, we replaced lower value items with items that currently carried higher values. This was done to ensure that drop tables still carry some weight and variety across the table as a whole, rather than continuing to drop already low value items at even lower quantities. On the flip side, we increased the chance for rare items in several places, remedying situations such as the Frozen Core of Leng, or slightly tuning the boot drop rates at Raksha to reduce how often they're dropped in favor of the other rares. Notably, you'll see an almost complete removal of items like the Inert Adrenaline Crystal and Serenic Scales. We've done this as the value of the items has dropped too significantly due to the sheer volume of them coming into the game. Limiting the supply of them in this way will allow them to regain some of their value again as time passes. In no particular order, let's get into it. For normal mode Kerapac, here are the nerfs. There's been a decrease to the quantity of coins, large plated orichalcum salvage, cannonballs, dragonkin bones, royal dragonhide, soul runes, uncut dragonstones, light animica stone spirits, primal stone spirits, fire battle staves, and inert adrenaline crystals were completely replaced with super magic potions in a quantity of 4 to 8. All of these decreases are somewhere in the range of between 30 and 70%. On the flip side, there's been an increase in the maximum drop quantity of manuscripts of Jas, where you used to only be able to get 1 Jas page at a time, and now you can get 2. And on top of that, a very minor one, but the drop rate of uniques has been increased by a lowly 1%. Now let's get into hard mode Kerapac. All of the commons like coins, salvage, cannonballs, dragonkin bones, royal dragonhide, soul runes, dragonstones, light animica stone spirits, and fire battle staves have been reduced in a similar way to normal mode, and just like in normal mode, inert adrenaline crystals have been replaced by super magic potions. By far the most notable change with hard mode Kerapac is that the drop rate for the fractured staff of Armadil has been increased by 13%. On top of increasing the drop rate for the fractured staff of Armadil pieces, there's also a general increase to the drop rate of all of the other rares by 6.2%. The above changes are aimed at reducing the influx of most of these items, including raw GP in the form of coins and alchables. The removal of the inert adren crystals similarly aims to choke the oversupply of them so that they can start to regain some value as time passes. This will be the same for the rest of the changes we'll discuss today. The maximum dropped quantity of manuscripts of Jas has been increased to make this drop more rewarding, with a similar outlook on increasing the drop rates of other rares such as staff pieces. Overall, for both normal mode and hard mode Kerapac, this makes sense to me. Especially with normal mode, considering normal mode Kerapac is a boss that not only can be AFK'd, but is frequently AFK'd. I think the value of the commons coming from the boss fight were higher than it needed to be. But even with where it's landed and the new numbers, I do still think normal mode Kerapac will be worth doing and worth going to, although you definitely won't make as much money as you did before. But that's kind of the whole point. As for an Iron Man though, you're gonna get significantly more manuscripts of Jas, which is pretty solid to me. When we're looking at hard mode though, by far the most significant change is this increase to the drop rate on the Fractured Staff of Armadyl. A 13% increase by my math is going to take the drop rate of a Fractured Staff of Armadyl piece from around a 1 in 147 per solo kill, all the way down to a 1 in 127 in a solo. This is very significant, and while it's still going to be very difficult to get yourself a Fractured Staff of Armadyl, this is a lot more common than it was before, and I'm glad to see some kind of correction to some of these Elder God Rares drop rates that are, in my opinion, just quite frankly too rare, and they have been since release. I know some people are going to disagree with me here, but I think for the average player, spending 10 or 15 or 20 hours at a boss to not get a single unique drop isn't terribly fun. So making some changes here that are more significant than just a percentage or two, I'm actually in favor of, specifically for some of the bosses that are known to be a little bit punishing in terms of a grind. And speaking of bosses that have some drop rate issues, let's take a look at the Glacor. We teased a little data on Glacor earlier just to explain how responsible it is for the oversupply and consequent devaluing of items in the economy. But now we're going to give you some more examples. Every day, Glacor is responsible for 95% of the Banite Stone Spirits entering the game, 81% of the Spirit Weed Seeds entering the game, 95% of the Crushed Nests entering the game, 55% of the Uncut Dragon Stones entering the game, and 55% of the Crystal Keys entering the game. On top of this, a total of around 8.8 billion GP in the form of raw cash and alchables every single day. As you can see from this sample of drops alone, Glacor is consistently oversupplying huge amounts of these items into the game every day, including the influx of GP. In the grand scheme of the game, these numbers may be a drop in the ocean, but coming from only one boss alone every single day with little effort makes this a clear problem. If you refer back to the data of gold sources earlier, although it's not a direct comparison, Glacor would come in 5th place for the amount of gold it brings into the game just with its raw GP and alchable drops alone. The above also doesn't include things like charm drops, which negates the need to do other content such as Slayer and even other bosses, and Starved Agent effigies, which give a generous amount of XP. The sheer volume of the skilling items has dramatically affected their GP value and feeds into the progression points that we were discussing earlier, as well as having a knock-on effect on skilling profitability and other PVM drop tables. The changes we've made detailed below aim to teach Glacor a useful combat teaching boss in normal mode, while hard mode is intended as the starting point for those who can comfortably do 5 mechanic kills. For starters, normal mode. Normal mode Glacor works a bit different to the other bosses we're discussing today due to how the mechanics section adds multipliers to the possible loot you'd receive. Instead of detailing how each drop would be affected, as it'd be too long to do so, we'll cover the core changes and show you how the drop multipliers have changed. The first of the normal mode Glacor changes is that 0 and 1 mechanic fights now have a separate drop table. Intended to act as an entry-level boss that can aid players in learning RuneScape's combat system, the 0 and 1 mechanic fights have instead found a lot of use in AFKing for great loot and decent XP. This change intends to maintain the original intention and discourage AFKing. 0 and 1 mechanic kills now will only give 1 drop instead of 3. Next on the list of changes is the mechanic loot multiplier. The quantity of drops received at Glacor is determined by the number of mechanics active, with each additional mechanic increasing the multiplier. We've reduced that multiplier across the board as these were drastically affecting the quantities of commons coming into the game. Hard mode Glacor, with its enrage and kill-streaking mechanics, will continue to lean on the concept of loot multiplying as intended. Taking a look at the change to loot multipliers, Glacor in normal mode has been absolutely gutted in terms of the loot multiplier to common drops. Previously with 5 mechanics active, your multiplier was 15, and now that has been nerfed by 5x, and at 5 mechanic Glacor, your multiplier is now going to be 3. On top of making changes to the common loot, there's also been a decrease to the quantity of charm drops at Glacor, where in 0 and 1 mechanic fights, the Glacor is now only going to drop 1 charm, and in 2+ mechanic fights, the Glacor is going to drop between 3 and 9 charms. On top of this, and as mentioned earlier in the blog, the Serenic scale drop has also been completely removed from normal mode. I know this might be seen as a bit of a hot take, but in general, I actually think it's really good that bosses like Archglacier AFK normal mode are being addressed. Even though they've been in the game for all this time, it's very clear and backed by the data that they're absolutely terrible for the economy and the state of skilling supplies. More importantly to me is all the progression stuff that we've talked about earlier in this video, where I feel like 0 and 1 mechanic Archglacier kind of replace the need to play the game, especially in the early levels and the mid game. So for me, although I'm sad to see that I'm actually going to have to pay some attention and think about how I'm going to get my trumps for summoning, I think overall those kind of experiences and that kind of planning and thinking probably leads to a better gameplay experience for a lot of people. Overall, I'm pretty on board with this one. But let's take a look at hard mode. In hard mode, the base quantity of coins, Hydrix bolt tips, medium blunt or calcum salvage, water talismans, water battle staves, crushed nests, Bainite stone spirits, and onyx dusts have all been reduced. On top of that, spirit weed seeds have been completely replaced with water runes, and Serenic scales have been replaced with cannonballs. And then we've got the biggest change of them all, which is that there's been an increased base chance for a rare roll and contribution from Enrage by 50%. This results in a 50% increased chance to roll a rare at the Archglacier. And on top of that, some of the weightings have been changed as well, where the chance of receiving a Frozen Core of Leng has been increased by 4%, where the chance of receiving a Scripture of Wen and a Leng artifact have both been reduced by 2% respectively. Firstly, the base quantities of many of the hard mode drops were reduced due to the sheer number of these items being introduced to the economy each day. These values are multiplied by the kill streak number, resulting in overly high quantities of drops and the reason for their overall reduction. Simultaneously, we increase the chance to roll a rare and receive a Frozen Core of Leng by shifting the weighting from the Scripture and artifact, as we know a common feeling amongst the community is that Archglacier is a bit stingy with that drop. Spirit weed seeds were also removed due to the quantities of them entering the game each day and their price drop ever since Raksha's release to allow them to regain some value. To me, that's the first bombshell of the news post. A 50% increased chance to receive a rare at the Archglacier is going to be absolutely massive with regard to people trying to finish off those Leng swords and get those frozen cores. Since the Archglacier came out, people have been making memes and talking about how cores just don't exist. I hosted a data stream yesterday where I believe the person with the highest kill count at hard mode Glacier has something like 30 or 40,000 kill count. And as soon as I revealed the slide, everyone in the chat started spamming still no core, which kind of checks. The core was absolutely way too rare, and I'm glad to see a massive and sweeping change to this. I think especially with regard to Glacier, although it is nice completing a 200 kill streak and getting 950 million coins of common drops, I'm not going to the Archglacier specifically for the common loot. And the abundance of some of the commons, even on an Iron Man, is so extreme that it's more of a supply than I'm likely ever going to use or need. So to me, this is a completely fine trade-off, and I'm pretty excited to go back to the Archglacier knowing that my chances of getting a Frozen Core aren't absolutely terrible. Once this change goes live though, I'm definitely going to have to try out a 200 kill streak. I'm super curious to see if all of a sudden we're going to go from seeing 1 or 2 or maybe 3 drops in the chest to something more like a Telos experience where by the end of that streak, you've got like 8 or 9 different drops and multiple cores in the loot chest. All that to say though, I think I'm pretty okay with this change and I'm not terribly mad about the reduction of commons. I know with editing it's going to be slightly shorter than this, but I've literally been reading this blog for like an hour. But we keep it moving. Let's talk about Zamorak. In general, the common loot has been reduced pretty well across the board from the Zamorakian Undercity. This includes a massive reduction to huge bladed rune salvage, as well as a reduction of soul runes, blood runes, death runes, fire runes, dark animica stone spirits, and phasmonite stone spirits. In normal mode, there's also been a decrease to the chance of receiving onyx dust by 3%, and Serenic scales have been replaced once again by spiky rune salvage. On the other side of the coin, there's been an increased chance to receive any of the slivers of pain, power, and strength by a very minimal 1% each. The blog says that much of the changes to the Zamorakian Undercity drops were simply to add more variance in drop quantities, as items being dropped in static quantities each time. A bug preventing dark animica stone spirits from dropping was also fixed. The chance to receive onyx dust as a drop is also reduced, with the weighting being shifted back to the slivers. Now let's talk about Zamorak. Note, when you see a decrease or increase in value weight, these have the inverse effect because Zamorak's drop table gives an allowance for drops. Each drop is worth an amount of points, and these points are deducted from the total allowance. This means that the smaller the number of value weight, the more of that item could actually be received. Basically, a decrease in value weight is a buff, whereas an increase is a nerf. Now for the nerfs. Decrease the quantity of Torstal seeds from 3 to 4 to 1 to 2, and increase the value weight from 2 to 3. Decrease the quantity of dwarf weed seeds from 7 to 10 to 3 to 4. Decrease the quantity of blood runes from 200 to 300 to 150 to 250. Decrease the quantity of soul runes from 150 to 210 to 100 to 150. Increase the value weighting from 3 to 4. Decrease the quantity of Hydrix bolt tips from 80 to 120 to 40 to 60. Decrease the quantity of Onyx bolt tips from 120 to 180 to 50 to 72. Decrease the quantity of huge bladed salvage from 3 to 10 to 5 to 8. Decrease the quantity of accursed ashes from 25 to 30 to 10 to 12. Decrease the value weighting from 2 to 1. Decrease the quantity of small plated or calcum salvage from 10 to 18 to 5 to 8. Increase the value weight from 3 to 4. Decrease the quantity of huge bladed rune salvage from 10 to 18 to 5 to 8. Decrease the quantity of infernal pyroclast from 7 to 10 to 2 to 5. Decrease the value weight from 2 to 1. Replace the uncut Onyx with a Chaos Relic Uncommon that drops in a quantity of 10 to 20. Increase the value weight from 5 to 6. Removed Lanodyme seeds. Increase the value weight of the Chaos Relic Rare from 5 to 6. And increase the chance to receive the Bow of the Last Guardian piece by 10% at enrages above 500%. Much like, and in some cases even more problematic than, Arch-Glacor, Zamorak's drop table mechanisms and the enrage mechanics were heavily affecting the quantity of drops received. The decrease in quantities you see above is to bring this more under control, because like the other bosses we're discussing today, Zamorak is responsible for bringing a lot of these into the game. To elaborate on this more, every day Zamorak is responsible for 90% of the uncut Onyxes entering the game, the second highest being Next Angel of Death at 4.4%. 75% of the blood runes entering the game, the second highest is Nightmares at 6%. 80% of the Onyx bolt tips entering the game, with the second highest being Rasial at 11%. 79% of the Hydrix bolt tips entering the game, with the second highest being Rasial at 12%. 85% of the accursed ashes entering the game, the second highest being Greater Demons at 7%. 55% of the dwarf weed seeds entering the game, with the second highest being Rasial at 24%, and 70% of the Lanodyme seeds entering the game, with the second highest being Krill at 22%. Here's another fun statistic. As of writing this blog, in the past 3 days, Zamorak alone has dropped on average double the amount of blood runes that have been rune crafted by all players on those same days. Looking back further than 3 days, on some days, it was almost 4x as much. When it comes to Onyxes, Zami takes the cake. Uncut Onyxes have for a while now been near Alch value, though they did see a return in value in the mid-2020 to mid-2021, but they've since flatlined at Alch value. The change to this drop is to choke the oversupply and let Onyxes breathe a little bit. In terms of GP every day, Zamorak drops a total of around 31.1 billion GP in the form of Alchables, 8.2 billion GP in terms of salvage, 6.5 billion GP in the form of huge bladed salvage, 7 billion GP in the form of Hydrix bolt tips if high alching, and 9.48 billion gold in the form of Onyx bolt tips if high alching. If you remember our data of gold sources from earlier in the blog, the Spring Cleaner sat at rank 3, bringing in an average of 39.4 billion GP each day. Although it's not a direct comparison, Zamorak alone would almost sit at 3rd place for the amount of gold he brings in just with these 4 drops. Alongside these changes, we've also increased the chance to receive a Bow of the Last Guardian piece, along with raising the rates of rare item drops in the other bosses in this blog. So Zamorak is getting absolutely gutted here with regard to commons, but if you look at the amount of GP coming into the game from Zamorak, that is absolutely insane to me. I think something else that is worth thinking about at least here, or at least I'm thinking about this, and you can tell me in the comments if this is a cope, but kill speeds at Zamorak have also basically doubled in the last couple years. So even though loot is basically getting chopped in half with regard to the commons, it's still kind of going to feel similar in terms of GP per hour and like Alchables per hour compared to what it was when the boss came out. We've just had so much power creep that Zamorak is easier to kill than ever and more accessible than ever, and I think these changes are kind of reasonable through that lens. With that said though, I still can't believe that Zamorak is responsible for this amount of GP coming into the game. The data kind of speaks for itself. It's kind of completely insane, especially when you think that Zamorak isn't a boss that is killed by most players. It's not AFKable at all, and still, it just drops so much GP that it blows everything else out of the water. On the other side of the coin, to take the sting off just a little bit, I am glad to see that there is going to be an increase in the chance of receiving a Bow of the Last Guardian piece by about 10% at enrages above 500. I think this change could incentivize a lot of players to start pushing their enrage to try to reach the 500% barrier so that you have a significantly better chance of receiving a piece of a Bow of the Last Guardian. And as someone that spent 6 full weeks at Zamorak in order to get a single Bow of the Last Guardian on my Hardcore Iron Man a few years back, I'm glad to see the rate being improved just a little bit. But with Zammy out of the way, let's talk about Zuk. With regard to the Zuk minions, there's been a decreased quantity of Onyx bolts from 40 to 60 to 7 to 18, and a decreased quantity of large blunt or calcum salvage from 4 to 6 to 1 to 3. Cerenic scales have been replaced with Elder Wood Spirits, and it drops at a quantity of 1 to 2 on the uncommon table and a quantity of 2 to 3 on the rares table. And then most importantly, minions that respawn when failing Igneous Waves will no longer drop loot after the first time. In terms of normal and hard mode Zuk, the only changes here are a removal and a replacement of Cerenic Scales with Elderwood Spirits. The changes above were made to target Alchables and once again remove Cerenic Scales to let them regain some value. The biggest change overall, however, was to prevent players from purposely failing and repeating certain waves of the fight to farm drops from the minions while AFK. Looking at the data, we found a disproportionate amount of players killing regular and igneous to Zakkar Her on wave 4 of the fight. Instead, drops will now only be given on the first attempt of these waves. Failing and repeating will not give subsequent drops. This is a very significant nerf to one of the most popular AFK GP and XP methods in the entire game. This is something that I know for a fact an absolute ton of players do, and if you look at the price of a manuscript of full, there's a reason why it's like 20k or 15k, when it is one of the best pocket slot items in the entire game. And while I do like the very cheap full pages, I'm glad to see this being specifically targeted, as it does devalue all of the drops from Zuk, and I'd rather those drops carry a little bit more value and not be completely nuked to the ground because someone is AFKing wave 4 Zuk on 50 accounts at once for 2 years. Interestingly, at Zuk though, there are no changes being made to the rare drops, and while I do think sword pieces are relatively common in comparison to a lot of the other ones, and it's probably a reasonable grind, I would have been very open to seeing Magma Tempest and the Scripture of Full being made a little bit more common, both in normal mode and hard mode. That being said, the nerfs here are not terribly significant, and I would suspect at Zuk, you're going to find yourself getting a similar amount of loot to before. Plus, with wave 4 AFKing being nerfed, if you're doing actual Zuk runs, I wouldn't be surprised if the value of a lot of these items actually go up in price, especially with regard to the manuscripts of Full. So you could see yourself actually making more GP here than you were before. Next up on the chopping block, we've got Raksha, where a number of changes have been made. Decrease the quantity of small blunt rune salvage from 50 to 15 to 22. Decrease the quantity of medium, spiky, or calcum salvage from 12 to 18 to 3 to 7. Decrease the quantity of huge plated or calcum salvage from 10 to 15 to 6 to 8. Decrease the quantity of onyx dust from 75 to 125 to 25 to 33. Decrease the quantity of dinosaur bones from 80 to 120 to 60 to 100. Decrease the quantity of crystal keys from 25 to 45 to 10 to 14. Decrease the quantity of dark Animica Stone Spirits from 60 to 90 to 50 to 80. Decrease the quantity of light Animica Stone Spirits from 60 to 90 to 50 to 80. Replaced Spirit Weed Seeds with Arbok Seeds, and decrease the quantity from 5 to 10 to 2 to 4. Replaced Golden Dragon Fruit Seeds with Siku Seeds, and decreased the quantity from 5 to 10 to 2 to 3. Replaced Inert Adrenaline Crystals with Catalytic Anima Stones, dropped in a quantity of 40 to 60. Removed Cerenic Scales, and redistributed the chance to get this drop to other items on the drop table. Last but not least, decreased the chance to receive any of the Laceration, Blast Diffusion, and Fleeting Boots. This change effectively makes the ability books and Shadow Spike drops more common. Once again, many of the changes to Raksha were made in order to reduce the impact of Alchables and oversupply of commons. However, we also made the decision to replace some of the items on the drop table to give back some value to Raksha with other drops. As many of you rightly pointed out, Raksha's commons were already not that great. Much of this was due to the overabundance of items and subsequent bosses that have dropped those same items. We're sure many of you will be delighted to also see that Raksha now drops Arbok Seeds. And finally, we once again increased the chance of receiving some rares such as the ability books and Shadow Spike by decreasing the chance to receive the boots, which have also had a lower GP value for some time due to dropping more commonly. Overall, for Raksha, I'm glad to see that a lot of the community feedback has been taking on here, and I am really happy to see Arbok seeds being added, as they are extremely difficult to get unless you absolutely love the Rex Matriarchs for some reason. But that being said, I think the most significant change here and the most significant thing here is that Raksha has some of the rarest unique drops in the entire game. And considering how powerful Greater Ricochet, Divert, and Greater Chain are, I'm pretty excited that they're going to be a little more common, and it's no longer going to be this lottery ticket where you're doing Raksha for 10, 15, 20 hours hoping to get the Codex that you're looking for. A little more common and not getting 30 pairs of boots you don't need seems like a pretty solid trade-off to me, and I'm more or less on board with this. I am getting a little concerned about Serenic scales though, because basically every single good source of them has been completely replaced with something else. So I have no idea what people are going to do for Serenic scales from this point on, but as of right now, the only things that are coming to mind are doing Dark Beasts and killing Araxi. But outside of the Serenic scales that I think in general throughout this blog have been nerfed probably a little more heavy-handedly than they need to be, everything else on here makes a certain amount of sense. Wilderness Flash events have also had some changes made. For starters, the Sack of Wild Rewards has a decreased maximum drop quantity of Bloodweed Seeds from 3 to 2, decreased the quantity of Wyvern Bones from 5 to 10 to 4 to 6, decreased the quantity of Infernal Ashes from 30 to 50 to 20 to 40, decreased the quantity of the Muddy Key from 3 to 4 to 2 to 3, replace the Tiny Bladed Necronium Salvage with Tiny Bladed Orichalcum Salvage. Replace the Tiny Plated Necronium Salvage with Small Plated Orichalcum Salvage. Replaced Medium Plated Necronium Salvage with Medium Plated Orichalcum Salvage. And then the Sack of Very Wild Rewards. Decrease the quantity of magic logs from 250 to 300 to 100 to 150, and decrease the chance to get this drop. Decrease the quantity of coins from 200 to 300,000 to 75,000 to 150,000. Replace Large Blunt Necronium Salvage with Large Blunt Orichalcum Salvage and increase the chance to receive this drop. Replace Criminal Bolts with a Runes drop. This gives a random rune from possible regular and combination runes. This excludes Necromantic runes and Time runes, and added a very rare chance to receive Magical Thread as a reward in this slot. Removed Huge Spiky Necronium Salvage, and then removed Annihilation, Decimation, and Obliteration weapons. And then last but not least, and most notably, there's been an increased drop chance to the Dark Onyx core by 50%. Overall, I'm really glad that it's not just PVMing that is being addressed here, and not just PVMing that is being nerfed, as that felt a little bit targeted and a little heavy-handed. In general, I've liked the idea and the focus on things that are being AFK'd that maybe were designed without that in mind, but Wilderness Flash events are definitely a pretty significant offender, especially at the early levels where there's almost no need or no worry to try to make GP and progress your account, when all you need to do is wait for the next Wildy event, tap a rock, or hit King Black Dragon for a couple seconds, and you'll make hundreds of thousands, even up to over 1 million GP. That being said, I think Wilderness Flash events after these changes are still going to be extremely sought after and are still very, very strong for a lot of lower leveled accounts, and I do still think it might be worth addressing them in some other ways. I think Wilderness Flash events might be a perfect example of a piece of content where the rewards you get or your loot potential may depend ever so slightly on something like your total level in a similar way to the Giant Oyster. But that being said, that is a problem and a question and a discussion for another day. In general though, I'm really happy to see a massive increase to the drop chance on the Dark Onyx core, and that absolutely softens the blow of receiving reduced commons. I think for a lot of players that would previously never even go for or even attempt to get a Dark Onyx core, this increases the drop rate enough that this might become kind of a commonplace grind and a commonplace thing to complete on your account. There have also been some changes, as discussed before, to the Wilderness Slayer chest. This is a chest that you receive whenever you complete a Wilderness Slayer assignment. And the most notable changes here are an increase of the Annihilation drop chance from 0.1% to 1.1%. And that also applies to the Decimation and the Obliteration. This is a massive change, and I think it's really nice. Being able to get yourself a tier 87 weapon on magic, melee, and ranged purely from just RNG Wilderness reward sacks didn't really make a lot of sense to me, and especially considering how rare they were from Wilderness Slayer, I'm glad to see this corrected. I don't think that these weapons belonged in the Wilderness chest, and I think getting it a lot more commonly from Wildy Slayer seems like a much more fair and a much more balanced way to go about it. So personally, I'm a fan of this change, and I'm excited about the idea that it is now basically possible to get these weapons on a competitive Group Iron Man, because competitive Group Iron Man accounts do not get loot from Wilderness Flash events. So with this change now, getting a Decimation or an Obliteration are now back on the menu. Wilderness Flash events are a very popular piece of content, bringing players together regularly, especially for the special events. One of the biggest offenders in terms of drops here was the Necronium salvage, which has now been replaced 1-to-1 with Orichalcum. To maintain supply, the quantities of drops such as Bloodweed Seeds, Magic Logs, and Wyvern Bones were also reduced. One notable drop is Criminal Bolts. Once a popular skilling moneymaker for players, Wildy Flash events have unfortunately made this more of a redundant method. I'm just going to mention here that I think the other thing that has made Criminal Bolts maybe not so valuable is the fact that it is absolutely bowscape, and bows are significantly better than crossbows, but that's neither here nor there. We want to see that return, so we've replaced that drop with a drop consisting of regular and combination runes. Similarly, we removed the wilderness weapon drops as they were being dropped in an abundance from the reward sacks, but increased the chance of them on the wilderness slayer chest. The cherry on top of all of this, well, sure you'll be excited to see a 50% increase in the chance to receive a Dark Onyx core. 2 more bosses left, starting with Vorkath in normal mode. Increase the chance to obtain a Lord of Bones Incantation Codex by 17%, and increase the chance to obtain Vorkath's Spike by 10%. Also increase the drop quantity from 4 to 6 to 5 to 7. And then in hard mode, there's an increased chance to obtain an Invoke Lord of Bones Incantation by 40%, and an increased chance to obtain a Vorkath Spike by 40% as well. When we reviewed Vorkath, we determined it didn't need to receive any nerfs or replacements, and instead we've increased the chance to receive Vorkath's rares. This is really interesting to me because Vorkath is already one of the grinds that isn't quite as long as a lot of other ones, but considering the state of that boss and how generally disliked it is by myself and many other players, I'm still hoping it gets a cleanup at some point. But in lieu of that, at least now, if we're going to Vorkath, we won't need to go for nearly as long to get the drops that we want. I still don't think this is going to revive Vorkath, but at least for the people that feel like they need to get something from it and they don't enjoy the boss, they're going to have a quicker time getting her done. And last but not least, let's talk about Rasial, where there's been a decrease in the quantity of Onyx bolt tips from 80 to 65, decrease the quantity of Onyx dust from 60 to 45, decrease the quantity of large blunt Necronium salvage from 2 to 1, decrease the quantity of medium spiky Orichalcum salvage from 8 to 6, decrease the quantity of Torstal seeds from 40 to 5 to 8, and also split this drop into 1 of 3 potential seed drops and added Dwarfweed and Fellstalk seeds, dropping in a quantity of 5 to 8 and 4 to 7 respectively. And last but not least, replace the original Dwarfweed seed drop slot with a chance to get either Elder or Eternal Magic Wood Spirits, dropped at 5 to 8 or 4 to 7 respectively. Rasial is a consistently popular boss, especially given he's the source of Necromancy tier 95s. The changes above are aimed at Alchables once again, as well as things like Onyx Dust, which contribute to the Onyx issue we discussed earlier. The seeds are also reduced in quantity a bit due to the soul amount coming from Rasial, with the aim of choking supply a bit to allow them to regain some value. Here's some more data to highlight the situation. Every day, Rasial is responsible for half of the Torstal seeds entering the game and 25% of Dwarfweed seeds entering the game. On top of this, Rasial is also responsible for 45% of the Onyx dust entering the game. In terms of Rasial changes, there's nothing here I'm terribly mad about. I'm pretty happy to see Fellstalk seeds added, as in general, they aren't dropped from a lot of PVM bosses, and generally speaking, they come from a Slayer. Although I am worried that anything that ends up on the Rasial drop table in any capacity is going to end up decreasing in price significantly just because of how frequently killed and how camped this boss is. But with that said, we've reached the end of the world's longest news post. Thank you for reaching the end. Woo! And here we are at the end. We want to thank you for taking the time to read through this behemoth of a blog and hope that we've illustrated the situation and why updates like this are important. As always, we'll be keeping an eye on your feedback and monitoring the effects of these changes whenever they go live. Adjustments will be made where necessary as we watch the effects of these changes in real time. Finally, we'd like to hear what other content you think could use a game health update too. We have many things we'd like to correct and improve ourselves, but we know that you as a community are experts who have plenty of great ideas to share on this. I think everyone probably had the same thought as I read what other game content you think could use a game health update too. But hey, if the team is looking for feedback, I've got some. I would absolutely love to see direct XP, everything on the demand side of skilling supplies, treasure hunter, and proteins be addressed in a future game health update, because I do think all of those things do negatively contribute to the health of the game. I don't mean that in a snarky way, but if you're going to take the time to carefully look at data and make all of these changes and outline all of them in a blog like this and supply a ton of data as well, I think it'd be really worthwhile to take a look at the impact of some of those other systems that are in place as well. With that said though, this is a way better way of approaching this. And in general, I'm happy with the contents of the blog, and I'm mostly happy about the detail provided. I think the previous blog that just kind of said, this boss is being nerfed by this %, this boss is being nerfed by that percent, was kind of shocking and didn't feel particularly good. And I'm really glad that this blog kind of provided an opportunity to explain the specifics of this item is being taken out for this reason. In general, I don't think players are ever going to be particularly happy with nerfs, and I'm obviously not someone who's looking forward to getting fewer commons and less GP for the PVMing that I'm doing, especially with all of the other systems that are negatively contributing to the game. But I think as far as nerfs go, this has been extremely well communicated, and I'm generally very impressed by this blog that I have now been reading for about an hour and a half. With all that said though, I'm really curious to see how this goes over in the community, and I'd love to know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Something else here that really softens the blow for me is I have for years, especially as a predominantly Iron Man player, said that a lot of the grinds in RuneScape are just a little longer than I would want them to be. And I don't mean that in like an easy escape way and like drops should, be given out instantaneously the second you kill a boss kind of way, but every year more and more content gets added to the game. And when you're a new player that starts a new account, the laundry list of things that you have to or may want to complete gets longer and longer and longer. And that's sort of just a fact of MMOs and this genre. And to me, going back a couple of years and saying, you know what, this might have been a little over the top is fantastic. And I'm excited especially about the Frozen Core of Leng, Dark Onyx Core, increased chance of both the Last Guardian pieces, and the Fractured Staff of Armadal. I have been locked in the Kerapac dungeon far too many times on a new Iron Man account, and I'm excited that the odds are at least ever so slightly more in my favor. Obviously, the one clear omission from this blog was more of a discussion about some of the other systems in place that have a negative impact on the scaling economy. But to me, being able to see some of the data and some of the rationale and to see it laid out in such a very clearly caring way where the people who are making this update and Mod Breezy very clearly cares or he would not have put together this entire thing, it definitely helps soften it a little bit for me. This is a level of detail that is pretty impressive with regard to communication, and while I want to see a lot of other stuff addressed, and I'm going to continue to push for that as much as I humanly possibly can, I think in general, this has been fairly well done. But I'd love to know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree? Do you think this entire thing is the worst idea in history? And will you be rioting in Falador? With that said, thank you all so much for watching. If you made it to the end of this video, you are an absolute legend. I'm hoping people kind of just threw it on and listened to me go through the blog and didn't actually watch the whole thing. But either way, thank you all so much for tuning in. I really do appreciate it. As always, subscribe for more content that is probably not going to be me reading the world's longest news post. And with that said, I'll catch you very soon for the next video. Take care, everyone. Peace out.